Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hello, welcome to this. It is the Eggonomics podcast, the podcast all about rugby and, well, business. Today I'll be joined, as always, by Mark Evans. Mark was the CEO of Harlequins and now is currently the CEO of Fiji Drua, as well as having a multitude of experiences across the game. But before we do that, follow us on our main podcast, which is EggChasers. Listen to that every single week, me, Tim and Phil. In addition to that, go and find Tim Cocker on YouTube. Phenomenal channel. The amount of work that he puts in to bring that content on a regular basis, multiple times a week, well worth a follow. Go and subscribe. And of course, you can find me, because this podcast is sponsored by Beardmore & Co, independent financial advisors for pensions, investments, financial planning, all of that good stuff, regulated by the FCA. And frankly, anything else you need to know, go on our website and have a look. Beardmore & Co, independent financial advisors. Right, Mark, how are you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, not bad at all, really. Bit disappointed about the Flying Fijians performance at the weekend, which was poor.
Yeah, it's disappointing, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, we were obviously missing quite a few players, but nevertheless, thought we played better than that. We just didn't start well and then put the bit together and then fell away. So, not great.
Were you surprised by the result? Because obviously there's quite a lot of guys from Drua, and I thought maybe...
No, not really. Not really. You looked at the 23, I reckon we were about 15 short of our best team.
Yeah.
Which is a big number. And although we are developing more depth, I think that was just a little bit too much. So, got 11 guys coming in to the squad this week. So, it'll be a very different team that plays in Cardiff, I would imagine. So, yeah, no, it's sort of, yeah, but nevertheless, it's about, I know coaches and people like me say this all the time, it's not just about results, it's about performance, but actually...
it is kind of about results, though, isn't it? It is kind of.
Well, yes and no. It depends who you play, actually. I think, no, actually, I do honestly believe it is more about performance. And we could have an interesting debate about the England performances of the last 6 months.
You're all right.
Whether that is, is it, they haven't won many, but have they not made progress? I would argue that they have.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
It looks quite promising. So,
But that's exactly what I said on the podcast, which is I think England look like a proper, formidable international rugby team. And South Africa only win by a few.
They've got weaknesses. I mean, the front row is not as you would like it in terms of depth. And I say right across the front row in that sense. Against the very, very top. So it's no coincidence that although it's not a great New Zealand team, they've got a really good stable of props.
They have got some really, really good props.
And they've come through pretty much all together. I mean, the boy who I thought did the most damage, his name I can't remember off the top of my head. He was a number 8 until about 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, okay, so let me put this to you. I was thinking about the potential replacements for Dan Cole. So, of this generation, you've got Dan Cole and you've got Kyle Sinclair, who were the outstanding props. Neither of which I'd say were, even in their pomp, regarded as the best in the world. So if there
I'd say you've missed one out there.
Well, Which one would you be going?
I'd say you've missed that. I say you've missed out. The best scrummaging prop of his generation was Will Collier.
Well, hang on, you've jumped the gun there, because that's exactly where I was going to go next. Why was Will Collier never considered? There's a lot of big lads who could be developed.
These things. So we're really often down rabbit hole, and we'll come back to what we're going to discuss in a minute. But because this is meant to be the business of sport, not the intricacies of front row play. But nevertheless, it's as these things often are. It's a combination of circumstance as much as anything else. He overlapped. I mean, Will Collier was on the bench into James Johnson in the 2012 Premiership final that Quins won. So that is 12 years ago. He was in the grand final. And he then overlapped almost identically, I think they're around about a year apart, with Kyle Sinclair. And at the time, Kyle's style of prop was in vogue, and he had this wonderful Lions series, if you remember.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, I think, if I'm right in saying. Is that right? In 13?
Yeah, that's the one.
It wasn't. No, that wasn't New Zealand in 13. That was Australia.
No,
it must have been New Zealand in 17.
It was definitely New Zealand, because he jumps, doesn't he, and does something silly for a penalty or wins a penalty or something happens.
He has a really good series, and everyone goes, oh, they're at the same club. And externally, Kyle jumped ahead of him. Will then got injured at some point in the next couple of years, and you need this. But it did hide his light under a bushel for quite some while. Then Wilco Lowe was signed once Kyle went to Bristol.
Yes.
So internally, it was interesting. There was, and of course at club level, and under this whole international animal thing, I'm quite suspicious of. But
okay.
I do think there are some players, and I will go to my grave saying that Will Collier was one of them, who would have been more valuable at international level than at club level.
Yes, I kind of agree with that.
At club level, you can get away with being a moderate scrummager and be very, very good at other things and deserve your place. And you totally understand why the coach or whoever picks that person to start or play the most minutes. But at the very, very top of international rugby, if you can't hold your own at the very least with the best scrums in the world, it's very hard to win.
Yeah.
It's a necessary but not sufficient condition to win. Won't win you on its own, but it's very hard to win without it. And I thought Will Collier should have got 50 caps for England.
Yeah, and this is what I don't get. I mean, they've got these new central contracts now. They can go out and develop or do whatever they want or manage the development of players. Why not get a young tight head prop who you think might be the future and do something with him? I mean, they've got like Harper, but he's getting on a bit at Sale and he hasn't had a good season. Asher Apoka for Jaw, although I've got questions about his size. Aaron Painter's getting on a bit. I mean, they've already not considered Paul Hill. He's like on the scrap heap. I mean, there's so many props that they've gone through, and for whatever reason it is, they can't find a tight head. Who's the other one that is now an international for Wales? Henry Thomas, off to Montpellier. They've never found one.
I think I know people are saying this. There is a good crop coming through, and I think that is true. And these things do go in cycles. But anyway, come back to what we were saying. I think England are a pretty good side with a lot of promise. They're not yet at their scrummaging is an Achilles heel to a degree against the very best teams. And yeah, that will always be a weakness. But you look at the back five of their scrum, and Ollie Chesham's not even fit. And they got piles of back row forwards. They've got, it's a decent team. And I wouldn't worry too much. I really wouldn't. I think England are in a good place.
Yeah. Well, a better place, it would sound, than only, 18 months ago, a year ago, under Eddie Jones, because this rather remarkable book by Danny Kerr has been written.
Mm.
And I just kind of wanted your reflection on it because, I mean, presumably, would people be able to behave like this under your watch as CEO? Do you think, okay, first of all, what do you think of the claims in general? But then I'd like to know, how would you address that being a senior guy at a club above the coaches?
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good question. Which is what people say when they're buying themselves some time to think. Well, first of all, I should say I don't know Eddie Jones personally. So anything I say needs to be seen within that context. And of course, I do know Danny Care quite well. So, certainly for a long time. So, however, I think nothing that I've read of the extracts, and I don't buy the idea that, it's trying to sell a book. Now, look, if you've had a long enough career to generate enough interest from a publisher to give you an advance to get your ghostwriter to write a book, in the most part, then you can't be too vanilla. You've got to make the book interesting, and that you might argue, some would, that breaks the omerta of the changing room. Even though you're retired from international rugby, I've never quite bought that. I'd rather have an interesting book than a dull book, and I don't dispute, knowing Danny, and as I'm sure you have, you're in the UK much more than me, but so many of those stories I'd heard before.
Yeah, I've heard loads of them. I've heard some of Carl Ferns, I can say it now because he's no longer playing. I've heard players who've been at camp. I've heard the sausages story before. I've heard about how they went through all the doctors. I mean, I heard about all three. I mean, that's just common knowledge. I mean, we know that they went through a lot of doctors, which is bizarre.
I'm not for a minute doubting the veracity of what I've read so far in the articles, in the extract.
Now, there is another element of this, isn't there, which is, you can give me far more context to this, but directors of rugby are a different breed. They're not like your normal middle manager at all. They're not like anything, actually.
Well, I know what you're saying. I don't entirely agree. I partially agree. I think it's fair to say that anybody who reaches the level of being an elite coach, that's probably the best way to describe it, or an elite director of rugby, or an elite whatever, working in a key leadership role at a very high level in professional sport. I don't think there's one character type at all. I've seen people who are really quite quiet and very calm and slow to anger do the job really well.
I'm trying to
and I've also seen people who are more of the Eddie Jones style, let's put it that way.
But I guess my point would be they all have an edge. So
but they took the words out of my mouth. They all nearly do have, because it's very hard, and that doesn't mean they are all pretty driven people. It's not the sort of job that you can do half-heartedly. And I also have seen, and I would say so, this happened to, I can talk about this in a personal capacity. When the pressure comes on, and it inevitably does, and it's far more at international level than at club level, although it maybe doesn't feel that different, you can start behaving in a way, when you look back on it, you think, oh my Lord, what on earth was I doing?
I imagine.
You can lose a sense of perspective. I thought, interestingly, some of the most interesting bits of the book that Danny has put out there are not around Eddie Jones. I mean, that's got most of the headlines, and I understand why. That's how media works. I think the stuff he said about Stuart Lancaster was fascinating.
Oh, I've not seen that yet.
Stuart, I'm going to read the whole book because Stuart was very influential on Danny when he was at Leeds as a kid. And yet Danny is quite critical of the way the 2015, the 2015 World Cup campaign was delivered.
I can see, yeah.
And that's really interesting. He clearly likes Stuart Lancaster a lot, and Stuart's a really good guy, but he's got edge as well. But you can lose your way in coaching, in leadership. You can, and the pressure of a home World Cup, and you're not doing it deliberately. You're doing what you think you have to do, but it's very, very easy to lose your way. And I also would say, I think there is the difference here is you could say at club level, and I think this is true of lots of sports, football, rugby, a lot of the team sports, at club level, just being a martinet and very didactic and aggressive and almost sort of brooking no argument and a sort of hierarchical model with perpetual challenge and pressure being put on the players tends not to last very long.
I completely agree.
And the reason for that is you're with them so much longer than you are at international level. Right? They and also you've got far less strings to pull. You know, pretty much if you're running a club or a provincial, you are or Fijian Drua, you've got restraints. I mean, our constraint is we can't pick anyone who isn't Fijian. That's a pretty big constraint. You know, Newcastle Falcons are constrained by budget. All right. Most clubs are constrained by the fact that player could always go and play for a competitor who is of a similar level. So the power dynamic is completely different at club level. You know, take football. Well, you know, the manager at Barcelona doesn't like me. That's all right. I'll go and play for Bayern Munich. Or I'll go and play for Man City. Or I'll go and play for... The players got far more leverage at club level, whereas at international level, if the boss doesn't pick you, you don't get picked.
So
now,
this is fascinating.
What does that impact? Well, that means that you are not playing at the peak of the game that you're involved in. You miss World Cups. They come around once every 4 years. It's hard to keep your place in a national team, particularly one like England, where there are loads and loads and loads of good players. You know, there are hardly anybody who could say, well, okay, so you do get and coaches have to, coaching places like England and New Zealand and South Africa have to find this balance. You want a core of players that you can rely on. They tend to be your leadership group or people in down the spine or whatever it might be, however you choose to do it. And then you're looking for keep freshening it up or keep bringing the youngsters on or looking for I know we're not that strong there. We've already talked about props in England. So you're always looking for somebody who is English qualified you might be able to bring in. Well, that gives the coach a huge amount of power.
Yes, it does.
Because the player hasn't got, and that's nothing to do with the money. And, you know, in certain unions, then, you know, 20,000 a game or whatever it might be is not to be sniffed at. You know, I defy anybody not to be, even those of us who are not particularly money driven. It doesn't mean it's not completely unimportant. So when you're in a position, and also you're thinking, I can see how they think, because I know Danny's written, I wish I'd stood up more or I'd said more. Well, that's fine with hindsight. Yeah. Whereas at the time thinking, well, only 10 more days of camp, and then I'm back to my club for 3 months, and, you know, have a break from all this. And
so
and,
just on
and,
that.
And it's the line of least resistance. And also at the same time, it's totally understandable because people want to play for their country. They want to go to World Cups. They want the opportunity to win Grand Slams and and whatever, and they've worked really, really, really hard for it. And the alternatives at international level are zero.
Yeah, and I think that's a massive problem, isn't it? It's just we've had this debate before why I don't like international laws and the restrictions on where you can play and all the things around. And this would just be one of them, really, that you are at the mercy of a single national coach.
But you still are. You still are. I know what you're saying. It doesn't make any difference if take an example, and let's not make it all about Eddie Jones, because I think, and again, I don't know the guy, and you have to respect his. He's had a lot of success. He's had a few failures too, but he's been in the game a long, long time.
Well, he's had some catastrophic failures, is the answer.
Well, he's had some very, very notable successes. And
yeah.
I think again, you would say, make a contrast, right? Make a contrast. Who is the most sought after coach in the world of rugby? Okay. And I'd say it's probably, I know you're going to probably say Rassie Erasmus, but I'm going to say it's I'm taking a longer view here. In the last 20 to 30 years, it's probably been Wayne Smith.
Yeah.
Okay, a guy who I do know a little bit, not very well, but a little bit, who is genuinely respected all around the world. He's a lovely guy. He's got an edge too, as we said. That bit's a given. A lovely, lovely guy, quite mild-mannered, incredibly bright, besotted by the game, and and must have turned down more job offers than most of us have had meals. I mean, because that's just what he's chosen to do, and he doesn't operate. He has a completely different style.
Yeah.
Completely different, quite a cerebral, almost intellectual, based around a view of the game. And he's had a great track record as well. So I think, no, they're not all the same. And there are certain lines you can't cross. And I'm not saying that here, I'm very clear that Eddie has crossed these sorts of lines. What I'm saying is there are lines in coaching, right? You've only got to look at things like gymnastics.
Yes.
And swimming and a lot of those individual sports. And then you put on the added complication of often male coaches with female athletes. Now that's a real difficult area, a sensitive area, and a complicated area to navigate.
Yeah.
Team sports, there is undoubtedly a sort of, it's very male on the whole in rugby union. Of course, it's in men's rugby union.
In rugby union.
It's an incredibly male-dominated workplace. And with it, that comes a whole load of stuff that is almost unavoidable. So if you're not, and then you've got the whole thing about how you treat your staff as opposed to how you treat your players.
Yes, and this is an important point.
Some people
would you make the distinction?
Those two groups quite similarly.
And would you make that distinction too?
I'm not sure I would make a huge distinction. Although I suppose because I think you have to, I think not only is there a moral element to it, and there is, but there's also a pragmatic element whereby I think in the long run, and I know people say, well, you don't always have the long run as a coach, and I take that point, but if you are looking for sustained success, I don't think a very aggressive confrontational style is the most effective. And I certainly don't think it helps to constantly churn your support staff.
Yeah.
I don't quite see the advantage of that. And it's simply, this is not an opinion, this is a simple matter of fact. You have a look at the number of doctors and coaches and analysts and other people around the team, the churn of that group in those years was extraordinary, as was the churn of players.
Yes. Now, one of the things that I've always thought about Eddie Jones, and it's sort of a pro Eddie Jones point, and I think his behaviour, according to this book, and actually in general, has been pretty abhorrent. I'm not a big fan of how he's gone about things. But one of the things which I thought was really interesting, and I think quite smart actually, was how many different coaches he relied on. So you saw him bringing people from NRL, Danny Carey even references the AFL influence, Rugby League, Super League, up and down the country. And that, to me, is very, very smart, because actually what you said there is you don't have the long run and everybody copies everything. In fact, I think the one approach you can't really have in rugby, which I'm sure people will disagree with me now, is actually consistency. Because if you're consistent for too long, people work you out.
Well, it's fascinating, this whole area, and the answer is there is no answer, because and I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to this sort of stuff. I read a lot and go back into the history and look at other sports. So someone like Jack Gibson, you've probably never heard of, but is a legendary rugby league coach in the sort of late 60s, 70s, 80s, Parramatta. He never stayed at a club more than 3 years. He took the view that he could, once he stayed more than 3 years, his impact fell away. Okay. Now contrast that with somebody like Rob Baxter.
Yes.
Who has stayed at, and despite, I'm sure Rob's had any number of offers, but he has chosen, for a whole host of reasons, I'm sure, to stay and rebuild. To transition from a mid-table championship team to the best team in Europe, for that team to collapse for a whole combination of age and budget, and then to decide, rather than to cash in his chips, to stay there and rebuild it.
So I think with Baxter, just before we move on from him, I think he has some sort of IP there which we don't understand, whether it be player selection or there is something going on there. And I think it's somewhere around player selection and interview process or his feeling for a player, but it's very, very rare.
Here's an interesting one I had personal experience of, because again, I've met Rob Baxter a couple of times, but I wouldn't claim to know him very well. I admire him, but I wouldn't claim to know him at all. But I work with Craig Bellamy, who's the Melbourne Storm coach and has been the Melbourne Storm coach for well over 20 years.
Yes.
And it's generally acknowledged, either in the modern era, meaning in the last 30 years, either he or Wayne Bennett is the best coach in rugby league in Australia, which obviously means they're the best coach in rugby league.
Yeah.
And this is really quite interesting, because the public perception of Craig is the guy in the box, the coach's box on television, going absolutely apoplectic. And yeah, that is part of Craig's personality. No question. He's very emotional. Probably a bit less so now, but there's loads and loads of footage. And yes, he can be very, very confrontational and blunt and aggressive. And it took me a while to work out, why was this guy so successful? How has he been able to sustain success? Because the consistency of Melbourne Storm is just extraordinary. God knows how many grand finals he's taken them to, and never out of the top four in a sport that's set up that you go in cycles. They just haven't. And it took me quite a while, and in the end, I worked out there were a couple of things, but the most important thing in the context of what we're talking about, apart from that, you're tactically very aware and a great judge of a play and all that stuff that lots of coaches are. But the thing that I think balanced out the confrontation and the aggression, which was part of his personality and his commitment and drive, he absolutely loved the players. And somehow, despite all the very direct criticism and all the rest of it and accountability that he drove incessantly, they knew. They knew he loved them.
Like, describe that for me. Like how do you mean?
I can't. It's very, very difficult to describe. And I'm not sure I was only there for about between 2 and 3 years. I'm not sure I ever quite got to the bottom of it. But it was quite clear.
I mean, was it
that and I think part of it was passed on, and part of it was because he used to do things for players after they left the club.
Right, okay, yeah.
When there was nothing in it for him other than, I have a loyalty to you and I care about you. And it's,
so I'll tell you
it's
a guy.
very hard to put into words. And I don't want to sort of make it sound like a soppy romantic, because it was far from that. It was an incredibly demanding and challenging environment. But he stayed and still there. And I think if you are going to be a long-term, there are two examples from outside of our sport, but in league. Jack Gibson, incredibly successful, changed his club every 3 years. That was his way. Craig Bellamy, unbelievably, equally, if not more successful, been at one club as a head coach for 20 or over 20 years, never been anywhere else.
Incredible.
Right? There is no one way of doing it. There is no... If there was a cookie cutter, everybody would copy it. And the answer is there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
What I would observe, though, is if you choose, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with this, per se, if you choose the very sort of my way or the highway, highly intense, highly demanding, if you don't balance it out some other way, I think you've got a limited shelf life. Well, some people may do it and be really unsuccessful. Some people may do it and be very successful. But I think in the end, people just get tired. And at club level particularly, either the coach gets tired and says, I need a change, or the players get fed up in the end and say, you know what? I've had it with this.
Yeah, working to rule.
I'm gonna go.
So just on that, I think you can be dictatorial, providing you sort of bring people with you. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but it can be your way. But they have to understand why it is your way and what the method to the madness is. And then I think everything is fine. But when you don't explain your method, you've got a problem.
And then you've got and look, people talk a lot about successful teams and what it brings about, and some of the things that are in successful teams are contradictory. Okay, so it's generally felt that teams that have got a great deal of cohesion and know each other well and that has built up trust tend to be more successful.
Yes.
At the same time, it's equally generally felt that teams that are incredibly upfront and honest and hold each other accountable in, at times, quite a ferocious way are also very successful. And the very best teams do both,
yes,
which appears a paradox.
Yeah.
And I would argue that leadership in team sport mirrors that too. You've got to, if you are one-dimensional,
I'm not sure it is a paradox.
I'm not sure you can be successful in the long run at the same place. I think if you're going to be like you tend to be, you're there, you have an impact. It's 2, 3, 4 years, move on.
Do you know, I don't think that is paradoxical, because what you just described to me is the behaviour of brothers. I work with my brothers, so I can tell you right now that the things which are said between each other are very much holding each other to account, probably more than needs to be done. But that's exactly what you're describing there as a team.
I suppose coming back to, and people are fascinated by Eddie Jones, aren't they? Particularly in England.
Definitely.
And I'm not quite. I don't really want to buy into that because I think it's a much more interesting, broader kind of conversation. It's not. This is not just about a single guy.
Well, no, I think.
But from what I'm reading, you know, it was interesting. I'd like to know, and I don't know, that clearly for quite a number of players and staff, it wasn't consultative particularly. It wasn't collegiate. It was very sort of instructional and a lot of challenges. And what do I say? What do I say to this? Do I challenge? I wonder whether there was a group of players to which that didn't apply.
Yes, it sounds like that. Exactly.
I wonder, and I don't know the answer. I wonder actually if there were a group of players who were, if you like, in the inner sanctum, who were consulted and part of the whole. I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure it's the people you say, oh, well, James Haskell loved him, Courtney Laws, et cetera, et cetera. I don't mean those sorts of players. I mean, James Haskell loved him because he rescued his career.
Yes. Owen Farrell?
Well, I don't know what Owen thinks. I've no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certain. I mean, again, it certainly sounds like that.
Don't know Owen Farrell at all. So, don't know.
Yeah. So I think that you're right to say the more interesting thing in this story is not necessarily Jones himself. Like, it amazes me that we hold up these players in the way that we do for England. We make them heroes, but then to find out, for instance, like when the sports scientists got kicked out, or any of these events, that no one stood up. No one stood up to him. And Danny Kerr mentions that as well. And I think that is a major flaw in the character of rugby players. I really do. Well, I say this all the time.
Sure. I'm going to challenge that a little bit, JB. The appointment, and I say all this from a CEO's position as well, where, you have coaches, directors of rugby, whatever, and you are their boss, effectively. And how you choose to exercise that is an interesting debate in itself. How hands off are you? How where's the demarcation? All is quite interesting, and that's why I thought Owen Slott's article was really quite interesting about all this.
Oh, about the accountability to the
yeah. Where's the control and where are the sort of the checks and balances? Not control. Where's the checks and balances? Okay, what's an area where you intervene? What's an area where you don't? And that's not a precise science either. But the appointment of staff, players would never, ever see that as their remit.
No, I wouldn't say they would.
They just wouldn't. They would say the appointment of the support staff and the medical people and the analysts and the assistant coaches, that's the boss's job. We don't get involved in that.
I completely agree with that. However, I'll just give you a very basic example. If I saw a physio being spoken to in a way which I thought was inappropriate by our director of rugby at amateur level, I can guarantee 3 or 4 lads say that absolutely stop that now. Absolutely stop that now. But
and I think that comes back to the power dynamic, doesn't it?
Does, yeah.
It
does.
You haven't got a lot on the line
no.
With all due respect, have you?
That's absolutely
what
fair.
have you got to lose for speaking up? The answer, it's always, this is self-evident, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's easy enough to speak up when you've got nothing at stake or to lose. It's not easy, but it's easier. People still can find it very awkward and think and feel that they don't feel confident in doing so, but it's easier. It's far more difficult to speak up when you think I'm putting a lot on the line here.
Yes, I don't disagree. But, one of the core tenets of some of these players is they're great leaders. I mean, they're not the average run of the mill Joe, and
of the team, I'd say of the team, not the organisation.
Yeah, but I mean, fair enough. But then they leave the sport and they go around giving seminars about leadership. And you think, well, hang on a minute. What were you doing in this situation? And I think they'll look back at it, and I think they will regret it.
Well, they wouldn't be Robinson Crusoe then. We all look back on decisions we made and didn't make and think, geez, I wish I had my time again. I'd have done that differently.
But by far the more serious one, I believe, is the reaction in the Owen Slot piece by people in the RFU. I think this is far more serious because of the hypocrisy and because of this awful kind of process, Weasley word-driven excuse. Well, we had nothing on our desk. I mean, how many times have you heard about absolutely horrific stories being covered up by, well, we didn't get a complaint? And I think that there is a real case to answer there.
It's a really, you make a good point. And in sport, holding coaches, leaders of the playing side of the organisation or the union or whatever organisation is tricky because often they're in camp on their own.
Yep.
There's the whole omerta of the changing room whereby there's a sort of cultural thing, and this is not just rugby. Mm-hmm. Trust me, it's not. Whereby what goes on tour stays on tour. But in terms of what goes on in the team stays within the team. You don't leak to the press. You don't go whinging to your, etc., etc., etc. There are lots of things there that are sort of working against, making it much more difficult for someone who is in the same organisation but not in that group to get a clear feel for what's going on.
Yes.
It's often particularly, here, for example, we're all in the same building.
Yeah.
That makes a hell of a difference.
Yeah.
If I want to go and get a feel of where things are and individual players and whatever, and I can wander into a team meeting, or I can hang around the gym for half an hour, or I can go and sit down next to somebody at lunch and all that kind of stuff. And that's a big advantage. And again, it's a difference between a club and an international team. Off you go to Penny Hill Park or wherever they go these days. I may be out of date there. And I mean, how much time would any of the senior management spend down there? Not an awful lot, I would suggest.
It's a good point. However, with all the regular reviews and everything which happened at the end of they reviewed every season, didn't they? And they always kept the
I don't know.
Secret. Yeah.
I assume there was some kind of process, but I don't know.
We weren't even allowed to know who did the review. I mean, that's how ridiculous it all
was. And here you come to something that's really interesting, isn't it? I think I'm right in saying, but please, anyone knows better, correct us.
Yeah.
I think I'm right in saying is that the RFU and other high-profile sports bodies find it very, very difficult to get independents to come in and play a role, and you do need independents to play a role.
Yeah.
Unless they are given anonymity. And the reason for that goes back in England rugby to the point you may not remember this, but there was a review, and I think it might have been after 2011 World Cup, which did not go well. If it wasn't that one, I stand corrected, but I think it was. And that review, which was highly critical and quite personal, as good reviews have to be, got leaked with who said what about who.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Now,
Yes.
the difference
Yes, it did,
is
didn't it? Yes, I do remember this.
you do a review of a company, even a large company, and this is what is interesting. When people come in at a reasonably high level into the C-suite in sport, they say, well, most of the ones I know say, geez, it's quite a small operation, this, if they've come from a big corporate background. There's not that many people involved. It's not that big a revenue. It's a middling sized company. But the profile and the scrutiny is off the charts.
Yes. Yeah, it is. I mean,
And therefore, because people don't care about what's happening at Colgate Palmolive.
no, I mean, you could, yeah, exactly.
It's a massive company, far more complicated, far more complex, far more money on the line, far more people don't care. But my God, they care about Man United, and my God, they care about England rugby, and my God, they care about the All Blacks.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
Therefore, I do understand and sympathize to a degree about if you're going to hold your playing leadership to account, it's quite hard to get an independent, accurate view without putting all kinds of sort of checks and balances and anonymity and players often won't contribute unless they're guaranteed anonymity.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely fine. Okay, that is fine. However, it doesn't hide the fact that the RFU did know. Just because you don't know who did the review, doesn't hide the fact that they did know. And my argument would be is, look, if they stood up there, if Bill Sweeney stood up there and said, "We know what Eddie Jones is up to. It's very taxing. It's very hard. People will break." But this is professional rugby, and it's one of the hardest environments in professional sport. Yeah. Phone your mum. If you don't like it, phone your mum. I'd be absolutely fine with that. I'm absolutely fine.
Yeah, you would.
But he didn't.
But there is a line.
Yes, there is a line. But then again, he can be held accountable for it, and I'm absolutely fine by that. But it's the duplicitous nature of, oh well, there was no complaints on my desk. All right, well then you're incompetent.
Well, I wouldn't personalize it in quite that way.
No. I mean, I wouldn't say just about Bill Sweeney. I'd say anybody who then told me, well, my most expensive employee who we regularly review, who is key to my entire organization. Well, I had no complaints, so absolutely not.
I can see what you're saying. You're saying, I think they didn't look hard enough.
I think that they knew exactly what was going on.
You don't think they looked at all, do you?
I think they looked. I just don't think they were that bothered. And by the way, that's fine. But tell us you're not bothered. Stand by what you believe. And that is the problem fundamentally with the RFU, is we don't actually know what they do believe.
Well, again, I think broaden it out from rugby and say, okay. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things that sort of highlighted this whole area to me, was the last Football World Cup. Was it the World Cup or was it the Euros? Anyway, the last campaign of Gareth Southgate.
Yes.
And I'm a bit out of whack because I was over here and time zones were terrible and all the rest of it. But undoubtedly the most successful England national sports manager since Alf Ramsey, and you could make a case for more successful over a longer period of time than the great man. I wouldn't make that case myself, but I can see how you'd make it. Got absolutely slaughtered halfway through a competition.
So,
I mean, it was just extraordinary.
Yeah, okay.
It does make you think, it does make you think that, and you made the point right at the top of the show where it is different, and I think I think it on reflection you may have a point. The rules are almost, or not the rules, the framework is different in sport, but I think it's more to do with the level of interest and scrutiny, and you can, if you're not careful, get a little paranoid about it.
Yeah.
And coaches are well known for that. They obsess about we're being spied on, which actually there is some evidence for that.
Yeah, there is actually.
Whether it has any influence, who knows? But a lot of coaches are very much into the one percenters. Everything makes a difference. The margins are tiny, therefore you've heard it.
Yeah.
We've all heard it. So as a result, there is a tendency, I think I mentioned it earlier, to sort of lose your way a little bit or get jumping at shadows and wanting to control everything because so much of it is uncontrollable. Yeah, it's complicated.
Just from your career, have you ever seen a coach treat someone in a way which you think, do you know what? Maybe I'll let you get away with it once, but this can't continue. You need to calm me down a bit.
No, I don't think I have. No.
Interesting. I've heard
I'm trying to think of. Oh, right, okay, but I wasn't. That was when I was still a player. There were a couple of coaches when I was a player who I observed. They weren't coaching me. So I must have been it must have been I was starting up my very low level coaching career myself or something. And there were a couple of coaches going around really high profile. I thought, and I remember watching and thinking, you can't do that. That's abusive. I'm not comfortable with that. Yeah. I think, interestingly enough, it's got far, far less.
Do you think?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. And I do agree with the point we both made earlier about edge. Yeah, that a lot of the coaches are successful. Well, nearly all of them. They've got to that level, whether they're having a good season or a bad season. Rob Baxter is a great coach, and they're bottom of the league, right? Doesn't make him a bad coach.
Yeah.
Right. So you can't just go just on results, but nearly everyone who gets to that level has got, as we say, some edge about them. Sometimes you can't see it. Mark McCall, you ever seen him lose his temper?
No, never.
Never. I mean, the man's got an anodyne press conference down to a fine art. I mean, that's quite deliberate. But everyone, Mark's got an edge. He's incredibly quiet and thoughtful and stuff, but he's got a real edge. Conor O'Shea, one of the nicest men you will ever meet, has got an edge. So I do now think, and I suppose because most of my time, nearly all my career is in clubland, in various countries, in various sports, right? Therefore, I'm always a bit hesitant about international sport because I do think it's different. I'm not saying it's easier. In some ways, I think it is. But it's different.
Yes.
And the level of scrutiny is undoubtedly higher, particularly in rugby in England, where it's not the national sport. And what's the team most people follow? They follow England.
Absolutely.
Or Wales or Scotland, right? So it's got a lot higher profile. It's got more pressure. And you've got much more limited time.
Yeah.
So I do accept my view may be skewed because of my experience, which is largely in club, one level down. I suppose the closest I came to that sort of scrutiny was the NRL in Australia, which is unbelievably high profile. But on the other hand, I was in Melbourne, so we were a bit out of it. But even then, I don't think it's as common as it used to be. I really don't. The sort of the screaming, abusive, highly critical, almost frightening guy, and there were people like that. I'm not saying people don't have don't have a presence and it's slightly disconcerting and you wouldn't want to cross them. Oh, absolutely. Some coaches have always been like that and they always will.
I do think,
and they're very, very well aware of it. And I go back to Craig Bellamy. You didn't want to cross Craig.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I often think that the most abusive guys, the guys who really raise their voice, are the guys that lack the gravitas. So, in a way, it's the same. It's the same. They're just trying to recreate what they don't have.
You didn't want to cross Craig, and he could tear you off strip and all the rest of it. But they all knew he loved them.
Yeah,
and we come back to this. He cared. They knew he genuinely cared. From the youngest kid in the academy, all the way up to Cameron Smith and Cooper Cronk and Billy Slater, he cared.
I know I've already asked this once, but I'll ask it a slightly different way, I guess. Like, when you say he cared, how did that manifest? Like, would he spend extra time with them? If someone said, "Look, can you teach me this?"
Very good once they'd left the club. Very good around when they were injured, went out of his way to ask how the family were and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time was incredibly demanding and very confrontational and left you in no doubt where you had to improve. And I remember some visitors coming in and not being used to it, going, "Whoa, how the hell does this guy stay so long?"
Yeah.
And they didn't see the other bit.
Because you can do that if you've got the buy-in, I guess.
Well, and also, I think if you get it right, the players who've been there a long while can communicate to the rest of the group, actually, don't take, he's just the way he is in that way, but he'll look after you.
Yeah, I had a coach like that myself, actually, and it took me about a year before he'd even speak to me. But when you did actually get speaking to him, you realised exactly how much he cared. Not necessarily about you, but he did, but about everything he did. And I thought that was, it's just a learning curve.
So, mate, that was a really interesting conversation. It's just sort of, there's so many different facets to that. And there's the how does the organisation monitor the behaviour? How do the players perceive it? What do they react? What about the staff? Does it matter how long they're together and how long they're going to be there? The power dynamics. It's complicated.
It is. Well, going back to Union, not knowing what they believe in, we've had a report over the last month since we spoke last about how the RFU want to access kids in schools, basically. How are they going to spread rugby in schools?
Yeah, I've read it.
Are you as disappointed as I am?
I'm not as disappointed as you.
I
rarely am.
Yes. You can imagine my disappointment on this, right?
Yeah, I can. And look, I think you got to see this. I don't think you should try and expand what this was trying to do, right? This was trying to look at one particular bit of the whole ecosystem and say, are we in trouble here? Okay. And because schools rugby is an important element. See, it wasn't about club rugby and junior and minis rugby and sort of junior rugby. And I think that's interesting because in minis and juniors, you've already got a gradation. Anybody who's spent any time around a mini rugby club and a junior rugby club, under 15, 16s and below, knows there are about 3 different games in that continuum.
Yes,
right? 6-year-olds don't play contact, nor should they, right? And that's nothing to do with safety, okay? Although, that's a good byproduct. But if you ever watched a bunch of 6-year-olds play contact rugby, it's impossible to play, right? You can't do it. Right? It ends up in a heap. It ends up in a heap on the floor. Right? Their bodies can't actually play anything like what amounts to contact rugby. They can't, right? So understandably, we start off with tag or touch and small-sided games, and like every other sport does. Cricket does it, football does it, rugby league does it, everybody does it. You don't throw 6, 7, 8-year-olds into a 15-man game with scrums, lineouts, and tackling.
Yeah.
Don't be stupid. We know that. And then they gradually move up to around about 15, 16, and then you're there. And it's interesting, I think that one of the interesting things about the report was saying injury levels, because obviously it's part of the thing, but not the main part of the thing, until you get about 15, are pretty much no different to any other sport. So one thing I took from the report is the game should be much more self-confident, talking about that rugby, in whichever way you want to play it, contact, semi-contact, non-contact, is just as safe as pretty much any other sport up to a certain age.
Yes.
And that age covers nearly all of compulsory schooling, right? So can we stop trying to say, oh, look what's happening in the Premiership. Oh, kids shouldn't play it. I mean, that's just nonsense, right? Though those are two completely different games.
Yes, they are, aren't they? Yeah, worry about
and
you.
So
Yeah.
where we do, and I think why the report was commissioned, and I understand what they're worried about. I don't necessarily, is that competition for kids to play sport, a particular sport in school, is ferocious. And rugby is a very complicated game.
Yes.
It is. It's a complicated game to play. It's a complicated game to coach and to organize. And if you are not an aficionado of that sport, the temptation is to play something else you feel more comfortable with. I mean, I go back 45 years to my year of teaching training at Bristol Uni, and my second subject was teaching of games, not PE, teaching of games. And what you did, you gained 6 coaching certificates in 6 different sports: hockey, football, cricket, rugby, track and field, and one that I've forgotten. And that was so you could go into school and help out with a range of sports, right? Which I thought was just a fantastic way of getting more people who were not PE specialists into schools, state schools, don't believe in private education.
Do you not?
And my VAT, no,
Not at all.
No, not at all.
We'll pick that up later.
Socially devises and embeds elitism in, but let's not go there.
Okay, perfect.
So, not that we are going to abolish private schools anytime soon, so it's a purely academic sort of position. It's never going to get passed. But what a great way to get teachers into schools who can coach a range of sports. But it's ferociously competitive. We have fewer and fewer men in teaching, particularly in primary schools. So any sport, it's not a rugby thing, any sport that believes, as I think I share the belief, that if you can get young people in primary school, I think it's a distinction between primary and high school. Again, it's more complicated than just schools stuff. If you can get them playing your sport, what is likely to happen? They are more likely to follow it, maybe not play it, but follow it when they're older, because they have some kind of familiarity with it. And I don't care, and we've had this debate before, I don't care whether it's touch or whether it's semi-contact or whether it's full-on contact. I just want, in the words of the late, great Peter Deakin, I want kids to throw and catch a ball, not kick it.
Do you know, you've just...
Right? And that's where I stand on this. And where I have a problem with it, is I'm not sure it's adding anything new. It's just a continuum. And we've been doing that for a long, long time. You know, you go into any primary school, you won't see contact rugby being played.
No.
You'll see touch or tag. And I'm totally fine with that. I just want to see them playing something with a rugby ball. That's fine. It's like, and there's a very strong argument in PE philosophy that says schools' job should be, and I have some time for them. I'll come on to the elite rugby schools in a minute, which they do also mention. But I have quite a lot of time for this that says, if I'm a physical education teacher at high school, particularly, don't have many specialist PE teachers in junior school and infant school. My role is to make kids enthusiastic about sport, all sport, to introduce them to a range of sports to a relatively low level, because you can't cover them all, but cover a wide range. And those who show an aptitude and an interest, push them into clubs. Right? So, for example, cricket, really difficult job, really difficult sport to play at school, right? You've got to get a pitch, you need a groundsman, it's a complicated game.
Yeah.
You can be out first ball and lose interest. You know, it hurts, it's got pads, it's got this hard ball, it's really difficult. So what do cricket do? Well, they have a whole range of other sort of games that are sort of a version of cricket, and then they push them to cricket clubs, right? Now, I haven't got a major problem with that at all. The interesting thing is, which wasn't touched on, is that the elite schools of rugby, and the schools that take rugby seriously, in other words, their first 15 boys mainly, there's not much. There's more, but not much girls rugby in schools. That's being more difficult than in clubs. Interestingly enough, most of those schools that play a high level tend to be in the private sector. Not all of them. Some like Northampton Boys, state school, really strong rugby program. Traditionally, I don't know if it's John Fisher, where in Croydon, state school, used to have I don't know if it still does, but people like Paul Sackey and that came out of there.
Yeah, that's cool.
Really strong rugby program. There are strong rugby schools, and there's more in certain regions of the country than there are in others in the state sector. So I don't buy in, but there are also lots of very strong rugby schools in the private sector.
Yes, there are.
The interesting thing about England is, you compare it to Ireland, because Ireland have they lean very heavily into about 10 to 12 schools in Dublin.
They do.
Who take the game super seriously. Not to say there aren't some real strong rugby schools in Belfast. There are. There's quite a few down in Limerick, where it's played in state and private schools. Not much in Galway, in Connacht. But far fewer schools, but incredibly intense, and they all play each other, and it's highly competitive, and that produces more than enough players to populate your national team and be a world power.
Yes.
You could make the argument, which I'm this is a bit of a straw man. I'm not saying we should do this, but I can see the argument. You could say the problem with schools rugby in England is that it's not elite enough. Is that actually why don't we have, like New Zealand have, why don't we have regional competitions, and then the regional winners go and play a national schools competitions, and you have the best school in England 2025?
I'd love that.
We have always shied away from that. And it's not within the RFU's control either, because you have to get the schools that play to agree to do it. And they've always resisted. There have been various attempts over the years to sort of get it going. Wales has got closer to it, but they've hardly got any private schools. And the ones they have got are very small. So Wales has got something like it, but it's tended to be in the big sixth form FE college sector. But England's have got a lot of schools playing a pretty high level, but spread all over the place and not really. You could make an argument that says, actually, guys, what we should do, and this is a bit more like the Australian model, and to some degree the New Zealand model. Let's get as many kids as we can in primary school and high schools playing versions of rugby. Doesn't matter which version, just get them playing. Because that is what stimulates interest in this amongst many, many But the schools that take it really seriously, let's not be half pregnant, because it gets, that's an impossibility. That's the wrong one. I'm half wet, or I don't know what I'm trying to say. Let's be really serious about it. Let's turn this into a high profile, intensely competitive, compelling national competition, and which is a bit more what cricket do.
So
a little bit.
Right. Let me have a think about this. So the first things first. When a school really takes rugby seriously, you tend to find that rugby dominates the entire school, because it's just such a substantial game, a substantial endeavour, that it's inevitable. So what I mean by that is, I've been thinking back to my small, very, very small private school. There's 9 in my year, to give you an idea of how small it was. So we had to have 3 years combined to find a rugby team, but we were all right. You got to wear your first team kit. You got to wear your first team pullover rather than a normal jumper. The school was made to watch you. Just all these little things which made you feel important. And actually, the substance of the game couldn't care less. That wasn't the important part. It was the prestige of being tough. The respect that you got. All of these things mattered far more than the game. And that's why I don't understand touch for the life of me. What is the point? I don't feel that if I was given a funny shaped ball at a young age, I would have developed this love for rugby. I developed the love for rugby because fundamentally, what is it? It's this incredible contact sport. And I think.
But how old were you? How old were you when that happened?
13 years old is when.
Yeah. What about the 6, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds?
God, no,
You're just going to ignore them.
I never even got hold of a ball. I saw them.
And my point is, you can't ignore them. You've got to find, and this is why I think we're almost tilting at windmills.
Well,
here.
I would almost say that my experience shows you can. Because at the point that the things about rugby really attract you to it, you don't really understand at 6 that, this is a thing. And having a funny shaped ball, so what? Is when you get to those more advanced years, you think, actually, I wouldn't mind doing something which my mum doesn't want me to do, or hitting other balls or whatever it is.
If 93% of the country, you go to a state school, high school.
Yes.
You have a PE program, right? You have to, it's in the curriculum. It's extracurricular too, but it's in the curriculum, right? And lots of other sports are in the curriculum as well. And then if there is enough interest, and that tends to be to the teaching staff and what their interest is, or what the traditions of the school demand, then you run extracurricular teams. But you probably for boys, and increasingly a lot of PE lessons are mixed, things like gymnastics and swimming, all the rest of it. You go, well, what do we cover? Well, there's an enormous number you could cover. Yeah. Well, rugby is fighting for its share of curriculum time.
Yes.
Okay. Against soccer, against swimming, against gymnastics, against basketball, against volleyball, against trampolining, against, difficult for that big number. And you've got year groups of 150, 200. I taught at school with a year group of 300. Right? Now, if it's a numbers game, and I've got no problem at all, you might want to use 7s, you might want to use 10s. I don't care. I just want a form of rugby played by as many children as possible. We've got a club structure as well, sitting alongside it. And the one bit, and I must go, because we've been going on long enough, the one thing I would take real exception to, and I think it's got the causation wrong, is this. I did see a comment from a fairly senior executive in the RFU saying, young people these days won't sit through 80 minutes.
Oh, shut up.
I fundamentally disagree with that.
So do I.
And I'm sorry, well, you mean they don't watch Premiership football, do they?
Bigotry and low expectations.
and they don't want America. They don't watch American football, AFL or rugby league. They all, like rugby union, take 80, 90 or longer. I think that's got causation. And what's happened is, I know what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, because we now have different distribution of content.
Yes.
You can watch clips, you can watch highlights, you can watch, medium highlight, extended highlights. You can watch the whole game. You can watch it on demand. You can watch it on various platforms. We all know that, right? But please don't say you have to therefore make the game simpler. American football is an incredibly complicated game.
Quite right.
Right?
Quite right.
It's the most popular game in global sport by a country mile. Why is it so popular? Well, partly cultural, partly heritage, partly tradition, partly the fact, and this is my last argument against your view, I think, and part of the reason, because it's the most popular sport in school in the United States. And yet they are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars driving tag football. Why? Well, two reasons. One, they recognize, and I think that report does, that's why I'm not totally unsympathetic to it. It does recognize there is a connection, of course, with a lot of fallout, but there is a connection. The earlier you can get a rugby ball into somebody's hands, they will have more likely to have more of an affinity, and it doesn't really matter what type. Mm-hmm. And secondly, although we know that injury levels in rugby up to the age of about 15, 16 are pretty much no different to nearly all other sports, that is not the perception.
Yes, that is very true. That is very true.
And perception's important. So if you can change people's perception by saying, well, look, here's a whole different versions of rugby. You can play this, you can play that, you can play the other. I don't think for a minute most schools are going to have 3 different versions of the game. They're going to pick the one they think is most suited to their age of their children and the other things they do. And if rugby can get better at that, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Just on flag football, I think there's 2 reasons that it goes on. I think number one is it's a massive box-ticking exercise for quote-unquote community outreach because things need to be done for unspecified reasons. And I think you're about as cynical about community outreach as I am, I think. But no, okay. I thought you weren't a big fan of it. Nevertheless.
No.
So I think there's a little bit of box ticking going on there. But I think that by far the bigger driver of flag football is the production of football consumers rather than football players. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have made that clear.
Yeah.
Look, getting more rugby played in schools is about generating more people with an interest in the game, which is what we need.
And this is exactly my criticism we spoke about this before, of the RFU style of coaching, which is it's not honest about what is required to be a great rugby player. Whereas the private schools who get the ex-pro in are brutally honest. Like, look, you've got to play hard, you've got to hit the gym, you might not touch the ball because you're going to be rucking a lot. It's more about how hard you play.
That's not the role of schools, unless they happen to be a relatively small number, and you don't need a huge number, as Dublin has shown, that take it super, super, super seriously.
Yes.
Right? You can do those 2 things can coexist, and you need both.
Yes.
Because without an audience, you ain't got a sport. And without elite players, you ain't got a sport. It's an ecosystem.
Yeah. But this is why I think it falls down, you see, because for a school to be successful with rugby, it has to embrace the things which are great about rugby.
Well, define successful in rugby. I think a school being successful in rugby, if they sent 10 boys and girls in a school of, let's say, 150 in a year group, sent 10 to 15 boys and girls to their local rugby club, having been introduced to at school, I would say that's a successful rugby school.
Right. So I don't know.
Can you imagine if that happened in South Manchester?
Yeah, that'd be great, actually. If we could just get 8 lads in South Manchester, we'd be laughing.
That's my whole point.
Yeah. But, you know, I am convinced, and I might have to do this anyway. I might be doing this anyway because I believe I'm probably the only man that would do it. I think we just need to go to schools with a video of absolutely massive collisions and rugby fights. I mean, I honestly, am I going to stand in front of a sixth form college or a bunch of fifth formers and go, look, guys, you're going to show respect to each other with rugby values. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a women's team soon. There's a LGBTQ week. No, none of that matters, right? None of it matters. Throw it all in the bin. This is why we do it. And by the way, all those other things exist too. But this is why we do it.
You're wrong.
I bet I'm not.
And I'm going to go now. Two things can be true at one and the same time, right? You need to have enough high level 14 to 18 years old programs running to generate the majority, not all, of your elite players. Yeah, you do. But at one and the same time, you need a whole load of other programs and other schools promoting this, participating in the sport that will generate more interest and effectively potential supporters and watchers of the game. Those two things are not, it's not an either or.
Yes, I think you've got a good point there. All right, well, look, let's leave it there because you've got to go. But
I've got to go. Better do some work.
But last question, and it's a one more question. Who is winning tonight, Trump or Harris?
I thought that's not one word answer. I was sure Trump would win in 16. I was sure Biden would win. I was sure Biden would win in 20. I was talking about this with my youngest last night, and who's very politically astute. Honestly, I just can't call it. It's too close to call. It's on a coin toss. Yeah.
Well,
don't know.
By the time this comes out, it'll be old news. Trump by landslide. You've heard it here first.
Too close to call. Take care.
All right. See you next month.
See ya.
Hi, this is Christopher Kimball from Milk Street Radio. I often shop at Whole Foods Market since they sell the kind of food I like. Organic vegetables, a great meat counter, and of course a great staff. For Thanksgiving, Whole Foods offers brine turkeys, as well as a spiral-cut bone-in ham. The Whole Foods Market Bakery has a large assortment of pies, even a vegan pumpkin pie, or grab some brioche and butterflake rolls for the table as well. Or you can ask the Whole Foods team to cater your meal for you, including the bird, the sides, and desserts. Get your holiday party started at Whole Foods Market.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
At Leidos, a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. A ship that finds enemy subs is smart, but an autonomous fleet, that's smarter. Defending against cyber attacks? Smart. Stopping attacks before they start? Smarter. And using AI tools is smart, but integrating trusted mission AI into your technology is smarter. We're not just making technology solutions in national security and health. We're making smart smarter. Leidos.